They laughed when he walked in, wearing a fatted jacket, carrying nothing but a folder and a tired smile.
Well, look who decided to show up. Didn't think you'd want to be reminded what the rest of us have been up to. What they didn't know was that the quiet man they'd spent years mocking now controlled more than they could ever imagine. Actually, there's something I think you should see.
What is it?
Come with me. They laughed when he walked in wearing a faded jacket and worn-out shoes. Just wait.
They laughed when he walked in wearing a faded jacket and worn-out shoes, carrying nothing but a folder and a tired smile. To them, he was just the single dad who never made it, the one who worked overtime while they built careers, bought houses, and posted vacations online. They invited him to the reunion for one reason only, to watch him squirm. What they didn't know was that the quiet man they'd spent years mocking now controlled more than they could ever imagine. And by the end of the night, every laugh in that room would turn into silence. Marcus Ellery hadn't planned on going to the reunion at all. For weeks, the invitation sat unopened on the kitchen counter of his small rented townhouse, wedged between a stack of bills and a school permission slip his daughter Ava needed signed by Friday. He knew what a 20-year high school reunion meant before he even opened the envelope, a room full of people he hadn't spoken to in 2 decades, most of whom remembered him, if they remembered him at all, as the quiet kid who worked the closing shift at the grocery store while everyone else went to parties. He almost threw the invitation away twice. It was Ava who convinced him to go. She was 14 now, sharp-eyed and stubborn in the particular way that reminded him painfully of her mother, and she'd found the envelope while looking for a stamp for one of her school projects. "You should go," she'd said, flipping it over in her hands like it was something fragile. "You never talk about high school. Maybe it'd be good for you." He hadn't told her why he never talked about it. He hadn't told her about Derek Callahan either. Not really. Just enough, over the years, in careful fragments. A boy who used to corner him by the lockers, who made a habit of announcing his family's financial struggles to anyone who'd listen, who once told a cafeteria full of sophomores that some people were just born to work minimum wage their whole lives, no matter how hard they try. Marcus had believed it for a long time. He'd spent his early 20s working 2 jobs to keep the lights on after his father's medical bills wiped out what little his family had. He'd believed it right up until he didn't. What Ava didn't know, what almost no one outside a small circle of lawyers, board members, and one very discreet business partner knew, was that the modest townhouse, the second-hand car, the same faded blue jacket Marcus had worn for years, were all choices, not necessity. Choices made by a man who had built something enormous from nothing after his wife's death, and who had decided, deliberately, that neither he nor his daughter would be raised inside the kind of wealth that made people forget who they were. He kept his company's ownership structured through holding entities that buried his name 3 layers deep in paperwork most people would never bother reading. He drove Ava to school himself. He answered his own emails at 6 in the morning before anyone in his office was awake. It wasn't hiding, exactly. It was protecting something, the version of himself that remembered what it felt like to be looked at like he didn't matter. The reunion was held at a hotel ballroom on the edge of downtown, the kind of place with crystal chandeliers and a bar charging $14 for a glass of wine. Marcus arrived in the same jacket he'd worn to Ava's last 2 parent-teacher conferences, folder tucked under his arm out of habit more than necessity. Old notes from a coworker he'd promised to look over later that night, the kind of small task that kept him grounded no matter how large his company had grown. He recognized faces immediately. 20 years had softened some of them and hardened others. But the room still carried the same unmistakable social gravity he remembered from hallways 2 decades gone, clusters forming around the loudest voices, old hierarchies reasserting themselves within minutes of the first round of drinks. Derek Callahan hadn't changed as much as Marcus expected. Still broad-shouldered, still louder than the room required, now dressed in a suit that fit a little too perfectly not to have cost more than most people's monthly rent. He was holding court near the bar within the first 10 minutes, recounting some story about a promotion, a company car, a corner office, the details shifting slightly each time he told it to a new cluster of old classmates, but the tone always the same, proud, performing. It was Derek who spotted Marcus first. "Well, look who decided to show up," he said, loud enough for the nearest 3 tables to hear. His eyes moving over Marcus's jacket with the same appraising sneer Marcus remembered from 20 years ago. "Didn't think you'd want to be reminded what the rest of us have been up to." A few people laughed, not unkindly, exactly, but easily, the way people laugh when they've already decided who the joke is aimed at. Marcus offered a small, unreadable smile and said nothing, setting his folder down on an empty table near the back. He had learned a long time ago that the loudest person in the room rarely knew as much as they thought they did. Across the ballroom, near the check-in table, the reunion committee had propped up a poster board of "Where Are They Now?" Printed photos and short bios volunteered by classmates ahead of the event. Marcus's square was blank except for his name and graduation year. He hadn't sent anything in. He didn't need to. Not yet. The first hour passed the way Marcus expected it to. A slow current of small humiliations, none of them dramatic enough on their own to seem worth confronting, but each one landing with the particular sting of a wound he'd carried for 20 years without realizing how tender it still was. Derek made a point of circling back to him 3 separate times, each time with a fresh classmate in tow, as if Marcus were an exhibit rather than a person. "This is Marcus," he'd say, clapping a hand on his shoulder just a little too hard. "We went to school together. Man, remember when you used to wear the same jacket every single day sophomore year?" Guess some things don't change. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel exactly, it was worse than cruel. It was careless, the kind of laughter that came from people who'd never once considered that the man standing in front of them might be carrying more weight, more history, more quiet dignity than the joke gave him credit for. Marcus let it happen. He'd built an entire career on the discipline of letting people underestimate him. In boardrooms, in negotiations, in rooms far more consequential than a rented ballroom with cheap wine and worse memories. He knew, better than almost anyone in that room, that the moment you correct someone's assumption about you too early, you lose the only advantage humility ever gives you, the element of surprise. But Derek wasn't finished. Somewhere, around the second hour, after a few more drinks had loosened whatever restraint he'd started the night with, Derek commandeered the small stage set up near the DJ booth, ostensibly to give a toast to the class, but within 30 seconds it had curdled into something else entirely. He talked about success, about the ones who made it and the ones who didn't. He gestured, at one point, directly toward Marcus's table, not unkindly enough to draw immediate outrage, but pointedly enough that every head in the room turned to look. "Some of us worked for what we have," Derek said, swirling his glass, his voice carrying easily over the low hum of conversation. "And some of us just showed up tonight to remind ourselves how far we've come. No judgment. Really, it takes all kinds." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the crowd. Marcus felt Ava's absence acutely in that moment. He was grateful, at least, that she wasn't there to watch a grown man mock her father in a hotel ballroom over cheap champagne. He kept his expression neutral, his hands folded loosely in his lap, and said nothing. It was a woman named Priya Anand, someone Marcus barely remembered from a shared chemistry class 2 decades earlier, who broke the tension, standing up from a nearby table with the kind of quiet firmness that made people listen. "Derek, come on. That's not funny." Derek waved her off with an easy grin, already moving on to another story. But the moment lingered in the room a beat longer than he seemed to notice. Marcus caught Priya's eye briefly and gave her a small nod of thanks. He'd remember that later. He remembered everything later. What Derek didn't know, what nobody in that ballroom knew, save for the 2 men quietly nursing drinks near the entrance, who had arrived separately from Marcus and hadn't approached him once, was that the folder Marcus had carried in with him wasn't old. Notes for a coworker at all. It was a briefing document, and the 2 men by the entrance weren't old classmates. They were Marcus's associates, present at his own quiet request, waiting for a signal that hadn't come yet. Because 6 months earlier, in a conference room 3 states away, Marcus's company, the sprawling logistics and manufacturing conglomerate he'd spent 15 years building from a single warehouse into a 9-figure operation, had completed the quiet acquisition of a mid-sized regional firm, a firm called Halbrook Distribution, a firm where, as it happened, Derek Callahan currently served as Vice President of Operations, a title he'd mentioned no fewer than 4 times that evening. each time with the specific weight of a man who believed the title made him untouchable. Marcus had known this for months. He'd said nothing to anyone. He hadn't come to the reunion planning to reveal it. He genuinely debated, right up until the moment he put on his jacket that evening, whether to attend at all. But something about watching Derek work the room with the same casual cruelty he'd wielded in high school hallways, something about the poster board with Marcus's name and nothing else beside it, had settled a decision in him that he hadn't fully admitted to himself until it was already made. The turning point came just before 9 o'clock when Derek, emboldened by another round of drinks and the easy laughter of the room, made his way back to Marcus's table one final time, this time with a photo from the old yearbook pulled up on his phone, a picture of Marcus in the same faded jacket, 17 years old and half smiling at a camera he clearly hadn't wanted pointed at him. "You know," Derek said, holding the phone out toward the nearby tables, his voice pitched to Carrie, "some people just don't grow. I mean, look at this. Same jacket. I bet if we check his car outside, it's the same beat-up sedan, too." He turned to Marcus with a grin that had curdled somewhere between nostalgia and contempt. "No offense, man. Seriously. But some of us wanted more out of life than just getting by." The room laughed. Marcus set down his glass. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply reached for his phone, typed a short message to the two men waiting near the entrance, and watched Derek's grin falter, just slightly, just for a second, as if some old, buried instinct recognized a shift in the air before his conscious mind caught up to it. "Actually," Marcus said quietly, and the room, sensing something in his tone that hadn't been there all evening, began to fall silent around him. "There's something I think you should see for a moment." Nothing happened. Derek's phone was still raised, the old yearbook photo glowing on the screen, his grin frozen somewhere between mockery and confusion as he registered the shift in Marcus's voice. Quiet, but carrying a weight the rest of his statements that night hadn't. Around them, conversations at the nearby tables trailed off one by one, the way a room slowly notices tension before it can name it. The two men near the entrance were already moving. They crossed the ballroom without hurry, one of them carrying a slim laptop case, the other guiding a portable screen on wheels towards the small stage Derek had commandeered twice already that evening. Derek watched them approach with visible confusion, his phone lowering slightly. "Who are these guys?" "Marcus, what's—" "Give me 2 minutes," Marcus said, standing. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. There was something in the stillness of his posture, the calm, unhurried way he buttoned his jacket and walked toward the stage, that silenced the room more effectively than any shout could have. 20 years of being underestimated had taught him exactly how much power lived inside restraint. He stepped onto the small stage where Derek had, minutes earlier, mocked his jacket in front of 200 people. The screen behind him flickered to life. "Most of you knew me as the guy who worked the register at the grocery store on 5th Street, Marcus began, his voice even, almost gentle. "Some of you probably remember I wore this same jacket a lot. You're right, I still do." A faint, uncertain laugh rippled through part of the room, not quite sure yet whether this was a joke or something else. "I want to tell you a little bit about what happened after graduation. Not because I need you to be impressed, but because I think some of you deserve the full picture before the night's over." The first slide appeared behind him. Nothing dramatic, just a simple company logo. Ellery Group. A handful of people in the crowd, the ones who followed business news more closely, visibly straightened in their seats. "After my dad's medical bills wiped out what my family had, I worked 2 jobs through most of my 20s, Marcus continued. "I started a small logistics business out of a rented warehouse with a partner and a loan I almost didn't get approved for. It grew slower than anyone expected, and then, about 10 years ago, it grew faster than anyone, including me, was prepared for." He let the words settle before he continued. "Today, Ellery Group operates in 14 states. We employ just under 6,000 people." The room had gone fully silent now, save for the soft hum of the projector fan. 6 months ago, Marcus went on, we completed the acquisition of a company called Halbrook Distribution. He paused, watching recognition spread across Derek's face in real time, the color draining from it in stages, like watching a slow, silent collapse. "I believe some of you might recognize that name." The next slide appeared, the Halbrook distribution letterhead, and beneath it, an organizational chart. Derek's name sat exactly where it had for the past 3 years, Vice President of Operations. But above it, in a line that hadn't existed publicly until that acquisition closed, was a new name, Marcus T. Ellery, Chairman and Majority Shareholder. The gasp that moved through the ballroom wasn't a single sound but a wave, rippling outward from the tables closest to the stage until it reached the back of the room. Someone's fork clattered against a plate. A woman near the bar pressed a hand to her mouth. Priya Anand, still seated at her table, let out a short, disbelieving laugh, shaking her head slowly. Derek stood frozen near the edge of the stage, his phone, still displaying the old yearbook photo, hanging loosely at his side, forgotten. His mouth opened once, twice, no sound emerging either time. The vice presidency he'd mentioned 4 times that night, the title he'd worn like armor, suddenly sat beneath a name he'd spent the entire evening mocking. "I want to be clear about something," Marcus said, turning back to the room before Derek could recover enough to speak. "I'm not up here to embarrass anyone. That was never the plan tonight. I almost didn't come at all." He glanced briefly toward Derek, not with anger, but with something closer to exhaustion. "But I think it's worth saying, in front of everyone here, that the way we treat people who seem like they have less than us says a lot more about our character than it does about theirs." Derek finally found his voice, though it came out smaller than anything he'd said all evening. "Marcus, I didn't know. If I'd known, I never would have." "That's exactly the problem," Marcus said quietly. Not unkindly, but without softening it either. "You shouldn't need to know someone's net worth to treat them with basic respect." The silence that followed wasn't the silence of shock anymore. It was heavier than that. The particular silence of 200 people's simultaneously replaying, in their own minds, every small comment, every laugh, every moment that evening, when they'd gone along with Derek's jokes instead of speaking up the way Priya had. A few people wouldn't meet Marcus's eyes at all. Others, like Priya, held his gaze steadily, something like quiet respect settling into their expressions. Derek stood alone near the stage, the yearbook photo still glowing uselessly on his forgotten phone screen, watching in real time as 20 years of careless cruelty collapsed under the weight of a single organizational chart. He opened his mouth once more, but whatever he'd been planning to say died somewhere before it reached his lips. The room was still holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next, waiting to see whether the quiet man in the faded jacket would finally let the anger show, whether 2 decades of small humiliations were about to come pouring out in front of the very people who'd inflicted them. Marcus simply nodded once toward the screen, stepped down from the stage, and let the silence do the rest. The silence in the ballroom didn't break so much as crack, slowly, like ice under weight no one expected it to carry. For a long moment, nobody moved. The classmates who had spent the evening trading smug glances now stood frozen, their champagne glasses forgotten in their hands, staring at the man they'd spent 20 years dismissing as the reunion committee's charity case. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He never had to. That had always been the quiet danger of him, the kind of stillness that made people lean in rather than look away. He simply nodded once toward the door, where his associates had already begun packing away the small screen, and let the truth do what pettiness and mockery had failed to do all evening. It made the room finally listen. The company on the display wasn't some obscure shell corporation buried in paperwork. It was one of the largest logistics and manufacturing conglomerates on the East Coast. The very same conglomerate that had, 6 months earlier, quietly acquired the mid-sized firm where Derek Callahan, the reunion's self-appointed king of the evening, currently served as vice president. Derek's champagne-flushed face had drained of color in real time as the slide changed. His own company's letterhead appearing beneath Marcus's name, listed not as an employee, not as a partner, but as majority shareholder and chairman of the board. The gasps had come first from the people standing closest to the screen, then rippled outward until the entire ballroom became a wave of stunned whispers. And Derek, who had spent the last 3 hours needling Marcus about his modest little apartment and joking, loud enough for tables to hear, that some men just weren't built for more than mediocrity, stood with his mouth slightly open, searching for words that wouldn't come. It would have been easy for Marcus to gloat. Every instinct in the room seemed to expect it. waiting for him to twist the knife the way Derek had twisted his for years, going back to high school hallways and now stretching into a ballroom dripping with rented elegance. But Marcus didn't raise his glass in triumph. He didn't smirk. Instead, he did something that unsettled the room even more than the reveal itself. He looked almost tired, the way a man looks when a burden he'd carried quietly for years is finally, mercifully, about to be set down. He spoke plainly. He talked about the years after his wife passed, when he was raising Ava alone on double shifts, and the kindness of a single teacher who never once made him feel small for showing up to parent-teacher conferences in his work uniform. He talked about the nights he sat at their small kitchen table building a business plan by lamplight after his daughter had fallen asleep, not because he wanted wealth, but because he wanted to prove to her, and maybe to himself, that where you start doesn't have to be where you stay. He never mentioned the years of being underestimated by name. He didn't need to. Every person who had laughed at him that night now understood exactly who those stories were about. Derek tried weakly to recover. He stammered something about how proud he was of Marcus's success, how he'd always believed in him, the kind of hollow backpedaling that only made the room's judgment sharper. But it was too late. The damage wasn't something Marcus had inflicted. It was something Derek had built for himself, one cruel joke at a time, without ever imagining the man on the receiving end held more power in his quiet hands than Derek would ever hold in his loudest boasts. The consequences unfolded fast, the way they tend to once the truth is finally out in a room full of witnesses. Within weeks, whispers of the reunion had made their way back to Derek's company, not through any vindictive leak from Marcus, but through the simple, unstoppable current of gossip among people who'd been there. His standing with the board, already fragile after a string of underperforming quarters, didn't survive the story of a newly discovered chairman he'd spent an evening humiliating in public. He was quietly moved into a diminished role within 6 months, the kind of demotion companies dress up in soft language, but everyone understands for what it is. Marcus, for his part, didn't involve himself in Derek's unraveling. He didn't need to. He'd built his life on the belief that real power doesn't need to announce itself through punishment. It proves itself through what a person chooses to do, once given the chance to hurt someone, and doesn't. Instead, he funneled his energy into something that mattered more. He started a scholarship fund in his late wife's name for single parents pursuing degrees while working full-time, quietly reaching out to 2 former classmates, people who had never mocked him, who'd simply been kind in small, unremarkable ways over the years, including Priya, and offering them positions within his company, not out of obligation, but out of the kind of loyalty only earned through decency. Ava, now a teenager, asked him once why he never told anyone at her school who he really was. He told her the same thing he'd told himself for years. That respect, earned quietly, is worth more than respect demanded loudly. And that watching people show you who they are, before they know what you have, tells you more about the world than any bank statement ever could. The reunion committee never sent out an official follow-up about what happened that night. They didn't need to. The story spread on its own, the way stories about humility and hidden strength always do, retold at dinner tables and passed between old classmates who suddenly remembered small kindnesses they'd shown Marcus over the years, hoping, quietly, guiltily, that he remembered them too. What lingered longest wasn't the reveal itself, the ballroom gasps, or even Derek's public unraveling. It was the quiet lesson underneath it all, that the people we dismiss too quickly, the ones we assume have nothing to offer because they don't announce their worth, are often carrying more strength, more history, and more quiet dignity than we'll ever bother to notice, until the moment we're forced to. So the next time you find yourself sizing someone up by their shoes, their car, or the modesty of their life, ask yourself honestly, how sure are you that you're seeing the whole picture? Because somewhere, right now, someone is quietly building a life far bigger than the room gives them credit for. And one day, that room will find out.